And now I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Tessa Knight, who's going to be joining us from Cape Town, South Africa. The floor is yours, Tessa.
Thank you so much, Andy. So I'm going to be talking about disinformation in Africa, and I'd like to introduce you to our panelists today. We have Hopewell, who is a Zimbabwean investigative journalist and Greenfield People Journalist of the Year 2020, who made international headlines after he broadcast his arrest on social media following an investigation into COVID-19 related procurement fraud. We then have Khadeja Ramali, who's a visiting fellow from the European Council on Foreign Relations and an independent social media researcher focusing on Arabic language spaces and influence operations in the Middle East and North Africa. Then we have Thandi Smith, head of programs at Media Monitoring Africa, a watchdog organization promoting ethical journalism in South Africa that has a very interesting platform called Real 411, which allows citizens to report disinformation. And finally, she's not on screen, she's joining us from phone. We have Rosemary Ajayi, who is the founder of the Digital Africa Research Lab, slightly different from the Digital Forensic Research Lab, which focuses on understanding social media use in Africa and mitigating real-world harm resulting from its misuse. Okay, so we're just going to jump straight into this because we have some wonderful panelists and I'd love to get to them. We're going to be, as I said, looking at disinformation in Africa, while obviously trying not to represent the continent as one homogenized country. Our panelists are going to be discussing disinformation, digital propaganda, influence operations, and freedom of speech over the next half an hour, after which, as we've already done so, we'll have some time to take questions. So I'm going to start off with Rosemary. As I said, she's joining us from phone. Rosemary, it's been about 3 weeks since the Nigerian government banned access to Twitter after one of President Buhari's tweets were deleted. Now, the government said that the deletion of his tweet factored into their decision, but ultimately the fact that the platform allowed misinformation and fake news to spread was their reason for banning it. But we've seen that Twitter's played a massive role in protests in the country, and SARS last year, for example. Considering this, what do you think the political implications of this ban of a massive social media platform will be?
Hi, Tessa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your question. There's one thing I just want to clarify before I go into the question, and that's the fact that aside from President Buhari's tweet, which was taken down, there was actually also another government account, another presidential account, which posted a video, right? And the tweet was actually a quote from the video. And what we saw was that the president's tweet was taken down and the video was taken down a day later, right? And whilst the president's tweet was taken down, you could actually still see it via quoted retweets for up to 48 hours after. So there's one thing that the row between the Nigerian government and Twitter has brought to light, and that's the fact that content moderation is inconsistent. And unfortunately, that seems to be where the Nigerian government seems to be focusing their energies. So when they say misinformation and hate speech is being spread on the platform, they're focusing on an individual known as Nnamdi Kanu. And he's the leader of a proscribed group who doesn't just use Twitter, he uses YouTube, he uses Facebook, he uses Instagram, he uses radio, even more than he uses Twitter. And that sort of helps you understand that, you know, the Nigerian government isn't really being as honest as they're presenting when they say that the reason why they banned this is to protect, you know, Nigerians' corporate existence. So you did ask about the political implications, considering the fact that Twitter is such a crucial tool for activists in Nigeria. And what I think is, or what we've seen is that activists will always use a platform. It doesn't really matter if there's a ban or if the internet itself is switched off, they will figure out a way to use it. I think, you know, for most people, the concern is the economic impact. And so you've got lots of small businesses, you've got larger businesses who, one yesterday tweeted that they were tweeting from Ghana, right? So are social media managers going to be losing their jobs? Businesses are afraid, you know, to tweet because we know what the Nigerian government is like, right? Everybody's being watched. And even though, you know, the government says that they're not going to be arresting individuals who tweet, we know that business will definitely suffer. But in terms of political use, could you just come back? Could you go over the question again, please?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to ask you what the implications would be for activists, for opposition candidates, but you have explained that people are still using the platform, which is obviously what we'd expect, although the government has sort of implied that the use of VPNs is potentially punishable, although we're not really sure what's going to happen there. But I essentially just wanted to ask you what you think the consequences of this ban will be for the likes of activists and opposition candidates who we've seen do use Twitter to spread messages.
Yeah, thank you. So the leading opposition party, the PDP, their members in the National Assembly decided to create a joint account on Twitter. So they're tweeting, they're defying the ban. Activists, like I said, activists are still tweeting. It's going to cost a lot more money in terms of, you know, battery power, in terms of, you know, repeat charging of phones. Some people are paying for VPNs, but activists will always find a way to get their voices out there.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you, Rosemary. So Khadeja, I actually wanted to follow up on something that Rosemary mentioned. She was speaking about content moderation. And I know that you have said in the past that content moderation, particularly on Facebook, I know we were speaking about Twitter, but on Facebook in North African countries is severely lacking. And one can imagine that it's relatively easy to then manipulate social media and spread disinformation when there's little moderation, you know, particularly in times of conflict when facts are sometimes hard to come by. I wanted to ask you if you've noticed foreign and internal actors using this lack of moderation to their advantage, and if so, what you think needs to be done to remedy the situation. I mean, obviously, I think we can both agree that banning an entire social media platform is not necessarily the answer to this kind of issue. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Actually, foreign actors try to hide using the modern Arabic. So the people that they're using, the outsourcing or the admins that they're using can be from any kind of country, and their accents will be hidden if they stick to modern Arabic. It's the domestic players, the religious figures, the domestic actors, either political, militias, armed groups, that use the difference in dialects to kind of hide their speech from the moderators or the content moderation automation system. And they usually do that when they're trying to either send a mob to somebody or incite some sort of violence or incite some sort of call to action. And they'll do it leaning on the dialect and not the modernized versions of Arabic. And I think that's harder for these content moderation automated systems to pick up. because it'll imply something. It won't be very explicit. It'll use imagery to kind of fill in the gaps of anything that's missing in the text. And I've reported many of these examples where the person is specifically in front of a victim's house and basically threatening them, their children, with death or just to burn down their house. And time again, these systems won't pick it up and will say there's nothing wrong with this. And it will continue even if the text is kind of like a bit inflammatory. But yeah, I would say it was mostly domestic actors, and foreign usually stick to kind of hiding in like really well-written Arabic. And sometimes that's how you kind of tell the difference between them.
So that's really interesting. From what I gather from you now, the local actors are getting around things by implying content or using images that the content moderation software can't pick up on. So I actually want to turn to Thandi now. Thandi, Media Monitoring Africa has this Real 411 platform which allows citizens to report disinformation. There's an evaluation process. A complaint can then be labeled disinformation, hate speech, etc. And in certain cases, it can be forwarded to the police or the Human Rights Commission. Do you think that South Africa, and by extension, Africa and the rest of the world, need more of these civil society organizations where you can report disinformation, say the kind of disinformation that Khadeja might see, that content moderation software might not pick up on, but a real person would pick up on? Or do you think governments should be doing more? What would implementing policies around disinformation, what would that look like? And do you think that in South Africa or in other countries on the continent that might backfire?
So I'm really glad that you're raising the issue of content regulation and regulation in general, because it's exactly why, or one of the big reasons why we developed the Real 411 platform. And it is because it's a complete, independent, multi-stakeholder approach to countering or combating disinformation. We deal with 4 different categories of what we call digital offenses, being disinformation, hate speech, incitement to violence, and harassment of journalists specifically. And we really feel that you cannot leave it up to governments to regulate platforms and regulate, social media. You can't leave it purely up to the platforms to regulate, because, one of the most challenging issues around any kind of regulation is the local context. And that plays such a big role in not being able to have, one blanket regulation that applies to all contexts. What is considered hate speech in South Africa is even different to what is considered hate speech in a very close neighboring country such as Kenya. So they are very local issues that need, local solutions. And that is why we feel that Real 411 is a step in the right direction. And, one of the sort of first of its kind in this sort of multi-stakeholder independent approach that is run by civil society. And so absolutely, I think that, we really do need more of these kinds of approaches, because like we have seen in many countries, it's very dangerous when you leave government left to regulate content. You start bordering on issues around freedom of expression and free speech and media freedom as well, which is why we take our sort of local legislation, apply it to how we assess the complaints, and then take action. And we also fit the Real 411 system into existing structures. So you mentioned, in extreme cases, the content could get forwarded to the police, or in more, or in extreme cases, bodies like our South African Human Rights Commission that already deal with what would be considered offline regulations and policies. So we have policies around hate speech. So we leverage off those existing pieces of legislation to assist in combating online content.
Thank you so much, Thandi. That was a wonderful explanation. So, Hopewell, I wanted to move to you. You have experienced being arrested. You sort of streamed your arrest or broadcast your arrest on social media, and you know, the government has tried to prevent you from tweeting certain things as well. So I wanted to ask you your thoughts on whether or not governments should potentially set up policies around disinformation, or do you agree with Thandi that this might be used to back up regimes or to censor the journalists like yourself?
Thank you very much. I totally agree with Thandi, because we already have a constitution and we have laws of the land that govern how we interact with each other. And places like Twitter and Facebook are just platforms, just like newspapers and TV stations, which are regulated using the constitution. The problem that we'll end up having is regimes like the one that we have here in Zimbabwe, led by Emmerson Mnangagwa, will use that as they are trying to do at the moment. After I was arrested in July, I was arrested again in November and again in January, using laws that don't even exist to effect those arrests. And now what they're trying to do is to come up with a law called the Patriot Act, where they say it is illegal to criticize the president, because the argument, which is very flawed, is that if you criticize the president, you are criticizing the person that is representing the country, so you're being unpatriotic. So the use of such laws is going to make it difficult for people like myself working in repressive regimes like Zimbabwe, because, for instance, in Zimbabwe, we're the only country on the continent that has only one TV station. And what happens now is we rely on social media platforms like Twitter. If I post a video of this discussion tonight, by the end of the evening, it will have been watched by over 60,000 people. And yet, if you look at the state media instruments that are controlled by the state, like the biggest daily newspaper in Zimbabwe is called the Herald, its circulation is under 5,000. And those 5,000 copies are not necessarily bought by people, but they're given to government departments for free. So they quite understand that social media has become the opportune platform for people to continue with whether it's political or economic discourse, and allowing them to bring legislation that will give them control, like what happened in Nigeria, will be very detrimental to our craft as journalists. If you look at what happened in 2019 in Zimbabwe, in January, there was a protest that took place. Young people were protesting against the increase of fuel prices, and internet was shut down. It had a huge economic impact, and I'm sure, as our colleague has explained about Nigeria, there's also an economic impact in Nigeria. In Zimbabwe, there was a company which had a contract with Safaricom, which is a Kenyan company, which runs the biggest business on the continent. It was affected because, as we all know, mobile money uses the internet. So there are huge implications, not just in terms of repression, but in terms of economics, because dictatorships are ready to shut down the internet or to use repressive laws, regardless of the economic consequences to nations.
Thank you, Hopewell. You actually touched on something pretty much answering my next question, but I'm going to pass over to Rosemary now, who again is calling from phone. We have seen, as Hopewell mentioned, we've seen an increase in internet shutdowns on the continent, particularly ahead of elections. In Uganda, very recently, we saw first social media access was throttled, and then access to the internet entirely was shut down, which, as Hopewell has mentioned, is particularly alarming in a number of countries on the continent because people rely on social media to get information. I wanted to talk to you about the impact preventing access to social media has on democracy, particularly considering Nigeria's current situation where they've blocked Twitter. What do you think preventing access to social media ahead of elections, or just in general, as Nigeria has done, how does that affect democracy?
Ooh. Hi again. So, I mean, across Africa, governments have been harassing or abducting journalists or shutting down media organizations for years. And so it's not exactly a surprise that we're seeing increasing attempts to censor social media or the internet, right? And one key reason why governments shut down the internet, particularly during elections, is their inability to control narratives and their poor understanding of online harms and how to address them, right? And in some cases, the media blackout or a social media blackout is put in place to hide electoral malpractices or violence perpetrated by the state. But in terms of the impact, I would say if you look at Nigeria, we've seen, at least going back 10 years, that young people have leveraged social media to boost voter registration. It's been used to encourage voters to stay at their polling units after they've cast their votes, to monitor the counts, to submit live reports, photographs of results. We've seen opposition leaders, smaller parties use social media as their campaign platforms because you've got 36 states and the capital, and it's, for a lot of them, it's cheaper to use social media. And we're also beginning to see the rise of audio platforms, right? So you can practically hold a rally on, say, Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces or, Facebook Live. And what we do know is that the state, which is part of, or the government, which is part of the ruling party, they have the machinery of the state. They've got national media, they've got national radio, they have their well-resourced to fund, media campaigns. And if social media is, or if, smaller political actors are denied the use of social media, it then means that the ruling party and their candidates do have an upper hand in terms of narratives and campaigning. But also you deny, activists and election monitors from doing their work.
Thank you, Rosemary. I actually, we saw that quite recently in Tanzania, where the opposition parties, when the internet was shut down, they didn't have the ability to campaign, to connect with people in voting booths, to try and get people on the ground, or to take evidence of any alleged vote tampering, anything like that. So I completely agree with you that it's definitely used to government's advantages, and the fact that governments have been increasingly shutting down internet and shutting down internet access and preventing citizens from accessing social media directly ahead of elections does imply how important social media is for democracy on the continent. So I wanted to ask Khadeja, have you noticed, I've been told since starting this job that disinformation and digital propaganda are low on the list of things that the African continent should be worried about, and that we should be focusing on more important things. But I'm going to completely ignore that and ask you what you think the impact disinformation, sort of influence operations and digital propaganda have on African countries. Obviously, you can speak to North Africa. And if you've seen an uptick in the number of foreign and, as you've mentioned, internal influence operations targeting African countries.
I think it depends on a base by base, country by country basis. For example, if you have Tunisia, most of the influence operations targeting them from the Gulf are they don't work on the domestic market. People are very politically savvy. They know their political standing. They know the different narratives. They know when like a campaign is happening, if it's from Abir Musa, if it's supporting Abir Musa, or if it's supporting local journalists who are going against specific political topics. Like the general public is aware of political maneuvering that takes the method of disinformation online. I think even in their elections that passed, it was an issue of political ads and sort of small scale disinformation. On the Libya side, I think it's much different. You've got conflict going on, you've got a tense political transition, you've got warring parties, you've got armed groups, you've got more than 70% of the country being online, and most of those people using Facebook as a way to get their news. You've had 40 years of dictatorship where the media wasn't really the media, it wasn't neutral, it wasn't objective, it was a propaganda mouthpiece. So even before people were online, they had disinformation. They had the regime kind of pushing out 20 different stories on something. So it's part of the cultural kind of background. And then people go online. And the past 10 years have just been kind of like a rumor mill of 20 different versions of one event. So it's like, what really happened? It's really hard, even for me now, like to figure out what actually happened when there's 10 versions of something, even when there's video. So I think it's a high priority for Libya. And I think for each country, we should be allowed to kind of like tell the story and be able to say, okay, this is a high priority, this isn't. And I don't think we should treat the continent all in one brush. But I get what you mean when politicians come out and say, this isn't a high priority for us, because either they're using it for their political gain or they just do not want attention on it. Yeah, I would go back to saying it really depends on the different circumstances of each country. Sometimes it's very critical and it leads to a lot of offline harm and a lot of instability, as is the case with some countries. And in others, it's completely controlled by the governments, and they use it for their benefit in different methods and techniques. And in other countries, the political maturity of the nation is just well enough to be able to avoid a lot of the damages that come with disinformation.
Thank you. I completely agree with you. Representing, Africa as a single country, it's a difficult thing to do. I just following on from what you've said about sort of getting that story and that information out there, I wanted to ask Thandi, how do you go about refuting the disinformation that's sent through to you? Oh, is Thandi still on? Have we lost Thandi? Okay, never mind. I'll move on. I did just want to make sure that everybody knows that we have a US spy in our midst. Hopewell, you have been called an agent of the US working to destroy the Zimbabwean government by a network of accounts that are referred to as the Varakashi, which in English is the destroyers. Now, it seems to be commonly accepted that these keyboard destroyers are working on behalf of the Zimbabwean government for President Mnangagwa. I wanted to ask you, as someone who has, I mean, I'm sure everybody on this panel has been targeted by trolls, but I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on governments using social media to target activists and journalists, and if you think that this is something that governments are increasingly doing, and the harms that this presents.
Thank you. I think this is what a lot of governments are increasingly doing. In our case in Zimbabwe, President Emmerson Mnangagwa specifically gave an instruction publicly that Varakashi go out there and rakasha them, which is go out there and destroy them, essentially to fight against what he perceives to be information that harmed his campaign and continues to harm his presidency, according to what he's saying. But essentially what these people do are part of the disinformation and misinformation team. What they want to do is to create a certain narrative. So for instance, if people point out to the economic decay in Zimbabwe, if they point out to the crooked and corrupt rule that is in Zimbabwe, if they point towards the looting of government funds and the plan of the nation's natural resources, these destroyers, they will come and point you towards what they call sanctions against Zimbabwe. And yet, when you look on the ground, like what I did last year, I was able to expose that almost $60 million was targeted to be looted by the political elites from the ruling party and by people who were around President Emmerson Mnangagwa. So these trolls, what they tend to do is to play dirty. They will throw into the public domain that is not correct. Before I was arrested and after and even now, they will go and throw something that would distract the citizen who perhaps might not be discerning to understand what's going on. They will start talking about how Hopewell is a paid agent of the United States of America, which of course is ludicrous. Or they will say someone who's as heterosexual as I people from the main discourse that is supposed to be taking place. And this has a huge impact, especially as we get into elections, because the government will continuously put into the public realm information that is not correct, information that is peddled by trolls. And their latest tool that they're using is they know that platforms like Facebook, they use algorithms. So if, let's say, 500 people complain about a particular post, Facebook will automatically remove the post. And that's what they've been doing in Zimbabwe. And they've also been going to Twitter using the algorithm system as well, where they will go and report something that they perceive to be truthful, but something that might be damaging to their client, Emmerson Mnangagwa, the president or the government of Zimbabwe. And then accounts were being suspended until we started writing to Twitter executives to say, look at these specific issues. Why is this account being closed down? It seems the majority of the accounts that are being closed down are linked to democracy activists, they're linked to progressives or people in civil society or journalists. So it's something that we have to learn to live with and learn to manage. We know that governments like Russia and China, they invest in troll farms for dictatorships in Africa. Zimbabwe is no exception. In Uganda, it happened. They even went to a point where the Israel WhatsApp for the Ugandan government. So there is technology for everything that is encrypted and meant to protect us as users and as citizens. There's someone else, especially with the Israelis, who is developing something that they're ready to sell to governments.
Thank you, Hopewell. That's fantastic. I see that we have about 11 minutes left. So I am just looking at some of the questions that we have here. Thandi, are you back with us? I don't see your visual, but are you here on audio perhaps? Okay, so Khadeja, Hopewell, and Rosemary, I think it's just the three of us. I have a question which I believe is directed towards Rosemary. This says, reflecting on China's Belt and Road Initiative, how do Muslim communities in Nigeria, for example, feel about China's attitude towards Islam? Further out, could there be a concern over copies of digital Great Walls being leased to governments in the future, replicating the one TV station model that Hopewell spoke about for national internets?
Hi, Tessa. Actually, yeah, I'm going to apologize, but that question is well outside the scope of my knowledge and experience.
That's totally fine, no problem. Let's move on then to another question. I have, again, this would probably have been a good question for Thandi, but I'm going to say maybe either Rosemary or Khadeja, you're welcome to jump in. If African governments are not willing to genuinely engage social media giants on curbing disinformation, should we rely on a sense of responsibility from these firms themselves in order to help stop the spread? If yes or no, how can African media engage relevant stakeholders in beginning or carrying on the conversations? Perhaps Rosemary or Khadeja, would either of you be willing to take on that question? I know it's a little bit difficult in that it's sort of referencing African governments kind of again as one homogenous organization. But the question seems to be revolving around whether or not, if governments are not willing to engage social media giants on curbing disinformation, should we rely on a sense of responsibility from the firms themselves in order to help stop the spread?
I'll just jump in. Like most times, depending on the country, either the government is authoritarian or there's more than one government, or the government wants to promote its own agenda. I wouldn't trust it to kind of solely make these decisions, but I wouldn't trust the platforms either, because at the end of it, either they don't want to say how bad the disinformation is on a realistic level, or if they actually do want to do something about it, they don't have enough context on the ground to be able to understand the damage or the harm. And even though they have the resources, I don't think they are interested to put more resources. And it's always looking at it from a kind of westernized lens, which I have a problem with. If you're going to look at an African country, if you're going to look at any country, look at it with new eyes. Don't bring the baggage that or the research that you've done in another country and cookie cutter it on top. And I think that's the problem with the policies that we have now. So I don't know, content moderation experts probably have debated this, but I don't think the answer solely lies with tech firms, and I don't think the answer lies with governments. But yeah.
Thank you, Khadeja.
I just wanted to build. Wanted to build on that, and I agree with Khadeja, in the sense that, in my experience, one of the things, and I know for a lot of people in this space, not just on the African continent, but in Asia, in the Middle East, what we found is that our governments are actually the largest and the most resourced bad actor on social media. And you then have a problem when you think that these are the same entities that will engage with the platforms, right? So that's one. Another is I think it's not necessarily that countries are refusing to engage. I think a lot of the people in leadership don't understand social media. They simply see it as a platform where young people disrespect them. they don't understand the language of social media. They don't understand the language of content moderation or the platforms. And I think in a lot of cases, the platforms also don't understand how to engage with African governments, right? Facebook took down the same post that Twitter did. Facebook didn't get banned, Twitter did, right? And it's the way in which they engage with the government that has sort of protected Facebook. So it's great to see that Thandi is back, but I definitely believe that you need a multi-stakeholder approach. You need some people from government, you need civil society, you need researchers, you need activists, platforms as well, all to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. Yeah, welcome back, Thandi. So I'm not sure if you will have heard, but Khadeja actually mentioned not necessarily having a sort of cookie cutter approach to tackling disinformation in Africa when we have, you know, taken our research from, say, investigating disinformation in America or in Russia. I wanted to ask you if you think that we should maybe have an Africa-centered or Africa-based approach. Again, potentially looking at Africa, if we were maybe to divide it into different sections, because obviously Arabic-speaking Africa has different issues to English-speaking Africa. So do you think maybe we should try and forge a different type or a different approach to tackling these kind of issues, as opposed to modeling our approach off of what the research that's already been done in the West? Thandi, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I disconnected. My internet crashed and it was one of those moments. Sorry, could you just repeat that really quickly? I know we're running out of time.
No problem. My question was just, I know you didn't hear it, but Khadeja spoke to not having a cookie cutter approach to tackling disinformation in Africa. And I wanted to know if you thought perhaps we should try and forge a new way of looking at disinformation and digital propaganda on the continent, or if we were to potentially break the continent up into the different languages, the different sections where people speak different languages, and maybe try and approach it from a different way, kind of an Africa-centered way. This is one of our questions from one of our guests, as opposed to looking at it from a Western eye, where we've already done a lot of research and we have tools to look at disinformation.
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree that you can't just have one blanket approach that will solve everyone's problems, you know. I think that although having said that, the concept of disinformation and the concept of propaganda is still theoretically the same thing. I mean, for us, the concept of disinformation is around sharing false information with the intention to cause public harm. So I think if we look at that as one of the key roots of the issue, we do then need to be quite flexible in how we approach solving the problem. And that's why a platform such as Real 411 is able to adapt to different local contexts. So you apply different measures and different tests to identify what is disinformation and what action can be taken. And I think that absolutely an African approach to solving our own problems is really the best way to go. We can't rely on existing tools because we are where we are, and it's clearly still a problem. So we need far more innovative solutions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Thandi. So we have about a minute and a half left. I think rather than going on to another question, I'm going to just thank everyone very much for joining in this panel. I really appreciate it. I know, Thandi, unfortunately you did drop off, but we do appreciate you joining us again. So thank you so much, Hopewell, Thandi, Khadeja, and Rosemary, for joining us and for your insights into looking at disinformation on the continent. I had a wonderful time speaking to all of you, and I hope that our viewers enjoyed this conversation. So thank you very much. And I will pass on to my colleagues back in DC.
Thank you.